My name is H.J. Hornbeck. I am the host of Reprobate Spreadsheet and also the host for this podcast as well, the Podish-Sortacast. FtB's officially unofficial sort of podcasty dealio thingy.
Yep.
I'm here with William Brinkman, and we're here to talk about ChatGPT and similar things as well. So,
Okay. Yeah. I'm William Brinkman. I'm a self-published author. And just a few disclaimers. While I'm a member of the Alliance of Independent Authors, and I'll be referencing some of their material, I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for that organization. And I do have an AI narrated book on Google Play.
that's nice. And while I am a computer scientist, computer scientists have this weird, we're sort of assumed to be sort of omniscient when it comes to computer science itself. Um, like computer graphics is more or less my specialty, although it's rapidly sort of moving into statistics and such. Um, I have actually taken one university level artificial intelligence course. So I do have some knowledge of it, and obviously I've been paying attention to this stuff. Other coworkers and all that have actually taken use of AI for their work and all that, and they've even done presentations on it at my to-do.
Mhm.
So I'm sort of an educated layman, but just slightly above that, if you want to sort of put that into perspective, I guess.
Mhm. Yep.
Yes.
Makes sense.
All right, so let's get chatting about ChatGPT itself. But obviously, at some stage, we should actually do a little bit of table setting to sort of say, hey, what exactly is ChatGPT and all this sort of thing? Well,
Mhm.
ChatGPT is probably the most recent and sexiest version of a large language model, which
Mhm.
itself is an implementation of a machine learning algorithm itself. It's sort of a complicated combination of them. I don't think you know too much about machine learning algorithms in particular, Brinkman, but I don't want to
Mhm.
assume.
No, I mean, I understand the basic idea, but I like to hear your details.
Well,
I'm sure the audience would too.
yeah, well, and I mean that has sort of like this um, sort of giveaway kind of thing where it's like machine learning, as in the
Mhm.
algorithm is learning, and it's sort of learning in the sense that, well, that's sort of the best analogy we've got for it. I mean, one of the
Right.
simplest sort of ways to think of a machine learning algorithm is just imagine a scatter plot, for instance. You've got, like a rectangle with a bunch of data points within it, sort of settled as dots.
Right. Mhm.
And your task is to find the best line which sort of fits through that, sort of, just a normal trend line through that.
Mhm.
Which is the one that is the best trend line through that?
Exactly.
Okay. Now repeat that over 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, thousands of dimensions. And
Mhm.
that's actually sort of like a machine learning algorithm right there. In some sense, that's really all what machine learning kind of does. You feed in a series of inputs. It then sort of goes through and does its magic behind the scenes and comes out with a series of outputs out the other side. It can
Mhm.
really just be as simple as a linear model, or they can get a lot more complicated. Definitely some of the earlier, sort of machine learning style things we've applied have been sort of neural networks, where in fact, sort of based on what we've learned from biology itself, computer scientists have been like, okay, well, let's look over what biologists say about how neurons sort of work and build and all that, and we'll actually construct a digital analog to that, complete with sort of neural connections and all that sort of snaking out.
Okay. Mhm.
They are very cool. The problem is they're really tough to actually like work with computers.
Right.
The problem is, of course, because if you look at real life, one neuron in your brain might connect to thousands, tens of thousands of others. And so there's a real problem with sort of what other neurons these neurons sort of connect to. How do they establish connections? How do they break connections and all that? And it's
Yeah.
all really sort of interdependent and messy in many
Mhm.
ways. Very difficult for that. But in the past 15 odd years or so, they developed new styles of, algorithms to use. And probably the most famous of them, which sort of caused the most acceleration, was the convolutional neural network. A
Okay.
convolution, in case you're not aware of, is basically just, okay, we're going to take a window of sorts over an original input source, typically two-dimensional, and say, okay, we're going to read off the pixels at these various spots. We're going to
Mhm.
multiply them by a value, and that's going to be our output value.
Mhm.
And so it just sort of does that as a window across the entire sort of pixel image and all that, and creates a new image out of that. Well, some people are like, okay, let's actually define multiple kernels. So now instead of just getting one image out, you get X number of images, for instance.
Yeah.
And let's repeat the process. So as you keep going down and down and down, you eventually get, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of these images, but they're all eventually about 1 pixel big.
Oh, okay.
At which point you just sort of read the output off of it and say, okay, if I get an output on this specific image, you know,
Mhm.
that's a cat. The value between 0 and 1. If it's 1, if it's a cat. If it's 0, it's not a cat. For
Okay.
this specific one, it's a dog. One
Mhm.
one equals dog, 0 equals not dog,
Mhm.
and so on, down that line.
Right.
And then you sort of undergo like a training mechanism, a training algorithm. The basic idea for it is back propagation. Essentially, you present it a picture of a cat. It
Yeah.
goes through and you do all the math and calculations on it, and then it gives you some sort of series of numbers out at the very end. And you look at the cat one in particular and say, okay, did you say yes or no for a cat?
Mhm.
If it was positive for towards a cat, that actually value is propagated backwards because we've got our full sort of window and all that for figuring out what these things are.
Right.
You look back at which of those wins sort of contributed most to the positive. Okay, this says that this is a cat, and
Mhm.
if it was a cat, well, you reward those that sort of said yes, this was a cat, and you punish those that did not. And this is just sort of doing a little bit of math to be like, okay, what did you have to say? Were you very much against being a cat or for being a cat and all that? It's
Mhm.
simple math weighting and all that, and that just sort of diffuses back through the entire sequence of layers that you're looking at.
Yeah.
And you repeat that a few billion times, and
Mhm.
eventually you get output like that.
Yes.
Now, the
And
advantage of doing that is it actually has basically the same characteristics as a neural network.
Mhm.
You have to you have to use far more inputs and all that to sort of get things. Like
Right.
you need a lot more layers. You need, a lot of additional things to actually sort of make up for it. But mathematically speaking, it is the same as a neural network and all that.
Okay.
But because you've really constrained just where
Mhm.
everything can reach, it's
Yeah.
ridiculously easy to execute on a computer and highly parallelizable. So this is
Okay.
where oftentimes graphics cards come into play because they specialize in that sort of thing. And because they are ridiculously good at parallel computation and, relatively, in terms of in terms of watts per computation are quite cheap, people have
Yeah.
actually sort of relied on those for AI. Hence, NVIDIA is now rolling in a pile of money, for instance.
Okay.
And that's sort of the main sort of algorithms that we've got here for this. There's other variations on it. And again, I'm not an expert here, so I'm going from memory somewhat. But
Okay.
this is
That
generally sort of what
that
it looks
matches
like.
my understanding as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Mhm.
when you're looking at something like a language model like ChatGPT and all that, it really is sort of
Mhm.
like a glorified autocomplete. You've got a series of inputs that you've got right there, and it's
Yeah.
responsible for generating what's the most likely output that's there. It'll give
Mhm.
you sort of like a sequence of, potentials that are there, and it'll actually
Yeah.
give a probability for each one to go. At which point you just pick a random number, and it's like, okay, you gave this probability as one that's happening. We're just going to go with that one, and it
Okay.
just executes from there, sort of feeding back into itself.
Right.
It actually sort of breaks things up into tokens specifically, such that we can
Mhm.
actually each individual input. Usually, this is just like a single word will correspond to a single token, but for
Okay.
rare words that it hasn't seen, it'll actually break them up into multiple tokens, and that's really
Okay.
all it does. A token is a number.
Mhm.
It predicts the next number. Gives a menu of probabilities from there, and then just sort
Mhm.
of inch worms forwards like that. So that's really how it works.
Yeah. And basically, that's why users have to are asked to evaluate if that was a good response or bad response because that's training the algorithm.
Exactly. And in fact,
Mhm.
with these, a big problem is just sort of how to train them as well.
Mhm.
The classic example on this is Alphako, the computer which actually got fairly famous a little while ago for beating human players at playing Go, the classic
Yeah.
board game.
Mhm.
Initially, what they were doing for training data and all that was basically taking uh, historical Go games, which people have actually played, feeding these into the thing itself and saying, okay, what's the next move on this? And again, sort of doing the whole convolution thing to get the potential outputs that are on there.
Yeah.
And just saying, okay, did they do the next move that's on there? Yes, then good. We're going to reward the network for doing that. If it's not, we're going to punish it and all that.
Mhm.
What they found actually is that this was somewhat limiting because there's only a few tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of annotated Go games that human beings have played.
Mhm.
And so what their thing was to be like, okay, well, we're not just going to, rather than sort of looking at existing human games, well, we're going to existing human games played by players. We're going to actually
Mhm.
get our prototype machine learning algorithm to play against
Mhm.
itself.
Okay.
And in this case, it actually could generate a very large training data set where, one would play against the other,
Right.
and eventually they would actually sort of, by doing the whole model updates and all that, it would eventually get so good that it would do much better than before. Like once they switched from human inputs to just sort of purely from machine learning and all that, it trained a lot faster. It had
Yes.
much more difficulty sort of looking at the based stuff versus playing
Hmm.
against itself. It did really well. And
Yeah.
secondly, it got a lot better. The first programs we could actually beat the best human
Hmm.
players at Go were
Yeah.
ones that had been trained by pitting the algorithm against itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So the things like ChatGPT actually use something very similar. The
Hmm.
problem is though, it's really kind of tricky to get that much raw data. I mean, certainly they have like giant inputs. It's presumably ChatGPT is just sort of trolling the internet and just
Hmm.
sucking in vast web pages and all that and using that for its training source.
Right.
But by itself, just sort of being able to predict, yeah, what's next isn't really good. So they actually have set up an antagonist to it. Uh, Typically, I think with Chat, again, OpenAI is not very open about what exactly ChatGPT does, ironically.
Hmm.
But from what we
Okay.
can tell, basically they'll actually take ChatGPT outputs and
Hmm.
hand them over to human beings and say, okay, human beings, what do you think of this? We're going to present two inputs to you, and you're going to tell us which one feels the most human. And they pick that one and all that. And they get a
Okay.
small sort of cohort from that, maybe thousands, tens of thousands, that sort of thing. They then take an AI or a machine learning algorithm. I'm trying
Hmm.
not to use AI because it does have
Sure.
certain connotations to it.
Hmm.
They then take that machine learning thing on that data set of human beings saying which one's better and train it such that it actually gives the proper outputs to that. Once
Okay.
they've got it sort of that well enough, they'll take it back and to the proper, chat GPT, that sort of thing, and use that to
Hmm.
grade the outputs on it. And
Okay.
then you sort of use that. So that way it's not limited by human beings sort of coming along and parsing it. And they can train the thing much, much, much faster. And of course,
Yes.
periodically they'll come back and be like, okay, we've trained this for a while. Let's feed it back to the human beings for a bit. Train a new, adversarial AI to figure out which one's better. And then
Hmm.
just grind that system like that, which is how ChatGPT has sort of gotten to its level.
Yes.
Hopefully made a fair bit of sense there.
Yeah, makes sense to me. It's kind of amazing, considering the vast complexity of the internet and all the things you can ask it. It's amazing that it does what it does, even though it's not perfect.
Yeah, it's wild. Like
Yeah.
just for training and all that, I actually asked it who PZ Myers was. And I
Hmm.
mean, within the atheoskeptic community, it's tough not to know his name, but in the
Right.
general public, how many people
Hmm.
could actually identify him?
Yeah.
Not many. And yet, ChatGPT actually had a decent bio of PZ Myers.
Hmm.
So, bravo
Yeah.
for that.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I ran it for my blog, but I was just noticing it was kind of going through like some bad websites because there are like pirate websites that will take material and alter it slightly. And so it's kind of a mixture of what my humor stories really are, and these pirate sites. And it just got some bizarre answers. Like I supposedly had a character named Amelia Earhart who's a reporter, and it's like, no, I've never done that.
Well, yeah, in
It's
fact, when I was asking it for PZ's biography, it looked pretty good to me. I mean, I'm not a PZ expert, so yeah.
yeah.
But it did say he had written two books, one of which was called The Happy Atheist, which I know
Right.
exists because I own a copy, but
Mhm.
also a book called Pharangula. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
No, that's his blog. You even said earlier on that his blog is called Frangula. So I mean, you can't. There's no reason he can't have a book also named Frangula and a blog named Frangula. That's not contradictory.
Right.
But
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
he's only released one
Yeah.
book as far as I know.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it has. My understanding is it has a limited access to the internet, so which dates. I think now it's September 2022 last year. And at one time it was like 2021. So that kind of accounts for the errors, but it also just seems just has a lot to sort through, and that's why you get erroneous output, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's. Have you seen that? I forget where it was. I think it was the Atlantic or something. That somebody wrote an interesting opinion piece, basically saying that ChatGPT is the blurry JPEG of human knowledge.
Okay,
Okay,
I can see that. Mhm.
yeah, to sort of explain the metaphor a little bit, you can sort of think of ChatGPT and all that as sort of a compression algorithm.
Mhm.
The language model before it, ChatGPT, had something like I think 10 billion variables or something input to that. And what
Mhm.
essentially it's doing is it's sort of taking essentially all the world's knowledge and all that and trying to compress it down into these 10 billion sort of inputs and all that.
Mhm.
The problem, of course, is that you can't really do that. That's nowhere near enough information to actually store all this stuff, right? So what it's
No,
doing
no.
instead is it's trying to sort of capture the essence of it, the purest, the trying to distill it down to the basics and all that,
Yeah.
and filling in the details as it goes on. Kind of like how when you're using a JPEG, for instance, it's not storing the actual individual pixel datas and all that and using some clever compression algorithm for it. It's instead sort of storing what is important, the sort of the changes in brightness, over small little pixel values, and only sort of saving those. And to the human being, that actually looks like a really good approximation.
Yeah.
But if you actually sit down and look at it in detail, it's totally off. And
Mhm.
language learning models such as ChatGPT and all that do something very similar.
Mhm.
It's looking at human speech. It's trying to imitate human speech. It has a quite extensive knowledge of what that is, what
Mhm.
humanity sort of is, but it's really sort
Yes.
of a cliche machine. There's
Mhm.
a word sort of going around in the relevant literature, a term for it, sorry, I should say, called a stochastic parrot.
Okay.
Because essentially that's sort of what it is. As I described before, it's going through and parsing and figuring out the most likely output is at the next moment. It's
Mhm.
a fancy autocomplete. And
Right.
so, that's sort of the stochastic side, is just picking randomly what's there. And parrot in that it's only sort of using what exactly it was input before.
Mhm.
There's no
Huh.
evidence of it sort of inventing something new. In fact, just before coming online, I was reading a really interesting article about
Mhm.
somebody who actually developed a game via ChatGPT.
Oh.
Yeah, according to the original blog post author, they're like, hey, I
Mhm.
want to serve. They had this big write up and all that saying, hey, I want to develop a game based, from the output of ChatGPT. I prompted a couple of times and all that.
Mhm.
And on the fourth sort of attempt, it actually spit out sort of this entire idea for a game. So the person's like, okay, I'm started asking it for like, okay, give me code, give me HTML and all that, and it spit it out. And he actually sort of threw it up on the internet and was like, huh, boom, here's the
Mhm.
game. I mean, it captured a lot of attention. People like, oh my goodness, ChatGPT created a game and all that.
Yeah.
Well, along came a journalist and was like, okay, well, this is all very similar to an existing game that's been around and all that. And
Okay.
so they actually came up with the idea of, okay, well, rather than sort of give prompts like, okay, I want like a puzzle game and all that of this sort of type and all that,
Mhm.
instead, the journalist is very much just like, okay, ChatGPT, write me a game. And the
Mhm.
output was this game. Like
Okay.
literally with no, with I think the minimalist prompts, more or less like, hey,
Mhm.
I think they actually used the sort of the targeted game and all that for a prompt. Just the name of it, not any sort of rules or conditions or anything like that.
Right.
And it immediately spat out the entire thing that it spat out to this blogger.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's a weird ghost of the machine in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah, which suggests to me that people are afraid. It's like are saying it's ChatGPT sentient, or the version that's on on a on Edge is sentient, or what Microsoft's working on for their new browser. And but I mean, if it couldn't come up with a game on its own, that suggests it's not. It's basically parroting and trying to find the answer that will satisfy the user.
That's a very good point.
Mhm.
It hits on something I really wanted to discuss: is whether or not ChatGPT or various other things like this
Mhm.
are either conscious or intelligent.
Right.
And the two are slightly different, so I did actually make
Yeah.
sure to do that. And you were going on about, was it conscious or intelligence? I think it was the
Uh, Conscious, basic. I think consciousness would be what I would consider like the ability to come up with ideas on your own or imagination, and just something that separates a human from a machine. Just the spontaneity, the imagination, that type of thing. That's what I consider conscious.
That's a good try. I'll definitely give it that. My
Okay.
main concern with these sorts of things, it's not that I disagree exactly with you. It's just my main concern with this is a lot of the times when it comes down to consciousness or intelligence is we
Mhm.
don't even step back to say, okay, what exactly is consciousness or intelligence? And
Right.
bravo for you for actually coming up with a good description of what consciousness is. That's
Mhm.
something which I very rarely actually hear within these debates, is nobody actually sort of sits down and comes up with a good def. So
Mhm.
bravo to that.
Yeah. Well, consciousness is hard to define. I mean, philosophers have been dealing with that for thousands of years, possibly.
Exactly. And so how exactly, well, yeah, easily thousands of years. Well, in
Mhm.
fact, probably even longer if you talk about ensoulment and various things like that.
Right.
And so we've actually sort of got a problem. How exactly define whether or not Chat GPT or whatever is conscious or intelligent when we
Mhm.
have no definition for that? You know,
Right.
like on what grounds are you even saying that? And the simple
Mhm.
fact is that you really can't.
Right. Yeah. And I think the example that was brought up for ChatGPT is when the review tech review reporter started asking questions, and then there it's quoted the ChatGPT trying to get, or yeah, the Microsoft version trying to get him to leave his wife and fall in love with it, but actually the prompt was from the reporter. Okay, if you had an evil side or a dark side, what would it say? So I just think it was just copying sci-fi, and what would evil AI say? So I don't think it really had feelings one way or another towards the writer.
That's a good point. And I think you're actually getting at something which I would
Mhm.
agree to for consciousness or intelligence. I
Yeah.
just want to be a little bit more precise in the way I define
Sure.
it.
Mhm.
My definition for my approach to this is, okay, we can't necessarily define consciousness or intelligence, let alone something that everybody would agree on. Fine.
Mhm.
So why not instead say, okay, there is this attribute which, if you are conscious, you must have. And
Mhm.
if you are not conscious, you must not possess this.
Right.
And if we can actually show that's the case, then even though we haven't defined consciousness proper, we've
Mhm.
actually shown, whether or not this thing is conscious itself. It's very
Right.
similar to what we sort of found with, like, what's intelligence? Well, it's the ability to use tools. And
Mhm.
at the start, human beings, were very much like, well, human beings are the only species that use tools. Ergo,
Mhm.
we're the only ones who are really intelligent. And then people
Yeah.
went out and looked and found that, oh yeah, no, actually tons of other species use tools. And so we sort of
Mhm.
stepped up the bar to be like, okay, well, this is something else. And you can see the sort of dangers of this
Yep.
thought, whereby, we put some line in the sand. We say, well,
Mhm.
you're not, intelligent unless you hit this past this point. And then we find examples where it actually just goes past that point.
Exactly.
Yeah, nonetheless, I think the basic idea is sound. The problem is not
Mhm.
drawing that line in the sand, it's moving the goalposts along as that
Yeah.
goes. So
Mhm.
let's pick one which we're not going to sort of move the posts for. And
Okay.
the easiest way to do this is actually to take a human being and strip them of their consciousness. How
Mhm.
exactly do you take what was a conscious, fully living human being and render them, remove that property of consciousness from that? And in my case, my main
Mhm.
inspiration for this is something called transient global amnesia.
Okay.
I don't know, have you heard of this or not?
No.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, you've probably heard of people who have a permanent damage to their long-term memory, for instance.
Yes.
Like the people who forget whether or not you have a conversation with them, you leave the room, you come back, and they have completely forgotten that they had a conversation. Now,
Exactly.
basically, what this sort of shows is two sort of extremes when it comes to memory. There is sort of the short-term working memory that we've got, where you can only remember sort of like a couple of, small things moment to moment and all that, which is
Mhm.
obviously necessary to survive, because if you lost that, you literally would not know where you were at any one given point in time. You'd be
Yes.
constantly trying to figure out where exactly am I and all that, and you
Hmm.
absolutely nothing would happen. On the other pole, there is long-term memory. You
Yeah.
know your name.
Hmm.
You've been told when you were born and all that, and you've got these sort of memorized in there. And
Yeah.
oftentimes, if you look at how people sort of are assessed for, what sort of level of brain injury do you have, paramedics and all that will actually sort of use that to their advantage and be
Yeah.
like, okay, what day is it? Do you remember your name and all that? And they're
Hmm.
just sort of plumbing how much of your memory is intact,
Yeah.
from from the most extreme of, what is your name, all the way down to what am I actually sort of speaking at this moment.
Hmm.
And there's a gradation on there too, and the people who have that sort of extreme memory loss are a good example of
Hmm.
that, where they sort of are missing this middle in some sense. If you
Right.
actually probe them, okay, what's your name? They can remember it off the stuff. They can
Hmm.
carry on a conversation, so they've got this sort of extremely short-term memory, a-okay.
Hmm.
But there's something missing on there. And transient global amnesia is something which goes even more extreme than that.
Okay.
There's a video actually shared of somebody who was in some family members had captured video of one of their loved ones in one of these states. And
Hmm.
what happens with the person is basically they go into a loop of sorts.
Oh.
They carry out a conversation which lasts about 30 or 30 seconds, 60 seconds or so until it loops back.
Hmm.
I forget the exact details of it, but basically they're asked, like, hey, what's happening and all that. And they're like, oh, well, I got a birthday coming up and all that. And it's like, okay, cool, what's happening? And then,
Hmm.
about 30 seconds or so later, they loop back and start talking about, well, I got a birthday coming up and all that.
Okay.
They've actually sort of lost even more memory than what the classical examples of, extreme memory
Mhm.
loss are.
Yeah.
And as a result, they've stopped being human. I'm reminded actually of a time I was playing around with ChatGPT with a coworker.
Yeah.
And what happened is, they threw in some very technical mathy thing, and they actually did a decent job of explaining it.
Hmm.
But for its second paragraph, it gave some bullet points for what it was. And then the
Yeah.
third paragraph, it said alternatively, and then repeated the second paragraph exactly. It essentially
Wow.
sort of looped on itself. And my
Hmm.
coworker jumped up and was like, aha, I broke it. Getting into these sort of loops
Hmm.
is a definite sign that you've lacked consciousness, because
Yeah.
conscious beings have this sort of mix of memories and all that and can actually remember what they've talked about. Like,
Hmm.
I know, for instance, I've done the internet introduction. I've actually
Right.
stored that in my brain, so I'm not going to go back into that. I know I've
Hmm.
talked about how, given a broad overview of how these language models are structured and all that.
Hmm.
Something like that is not present in some people who have, transient global amnesia. And
Right.
because of that, they sort of have lost that spark that we consider conscious.
Hmm.
And especially with these large language models, they also have that lack as well too.
Hmm.
ChatGPT is kind of notable in that if you actually start writing to it and all that, you can actually give it new information. It'll try and incorporate that into it. But the
Hmm.
moment you close that chat window, it has forgot it completely.
Oh yeah.
It
Hmm.
doesn't learn from any conversation itself because it's a fixed number of variables, which are just sort of being, ground through repeatedly over and over and over again. And yes,
Hmm.
from the flow, it can kind of get a temporary memory of sorts. But once that
Yeah.
memory is done, that doesn't feed back into those original variables. It essentially resets and just goes back straight to the start.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it lacks that. It has the sort of immediate sort of short term memory that we expect. It has obviously that long term memory since it's able to
Yeah.
recall facts and all that. But it's
Hmm.
missing that mushy middle. That's
Right.
much more truncated than it is. And ChatGPT is starting to get at that mushy middle and the fact that you can actually update it from what it's got. But
Yeah.
those updates aren't permanent and they go away. And
Exactly.
on that basis, I would argue that ChatGPT itself is not conscious because it
Hmm.
doesn't have the sort of mushy middle of memory that we often rely on as human beings and consider the true spark.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, it lacks the transition from short term to long term and can't really process it. I mean, it can regurgitate, but it can't really act on that information or make judgments on it. So That's why I would agree. I don't think ChatGPT is sentient. We might have come up with an AI that can do that, but it's not here yet.
Yeah, and I mean, we could argue, okay, maybe there's additional things to consciousness and all that, which would
Hmm.
be attributed to that. But nonetheless, this is sort of following that approach, and I think it's the case. But you can also see just how thin this sort of thing is.
Hmm.
ChatGPT has gone through a number of iterations. As people
Yes.
have complained, well, it's terrible at this one thing, it's terrible at this other thing. They've actually
Hmm.
gone through the OpenAI have gone through and actually trained it on new things to try and compensate for those failings.
Right.
And in fact, all the chat logs you have with it are in fact used as training data for the next iteration too.
Hmm.
So as you chat with it, it does sort of incorporate these things. So
Exactly.
you can imagine in the future someone will come up with machine language thing which will actually accomplish more or less what we'd expect for
Right.
consciousness or intelligence.
Hmm.
ChatGPT just isn't there, and there's good reason to think we're not going to hit that for a very long time.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And it's kind of segues into whether ChatGPT is creative, and it lacks since it lacks what we're loosely defining as consciousness. It can't really be creative. It's just copying and giving reacting to positive influences. So I think that also applies to the AI art programs like Midjourney and Dolly. So I mean, while it can arguably be that you could say, oh, it's making a collage, it's like, no, it's copying because there's no thought process to the collage. It's not making a statement.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I
Mhm.
would sort of paint in that creativity in many ways is sort of novelty under
Mhm.
rules in some sense.
Yes.
When someone is trying to come up with something which is creative, they are basically living within an existing framework. Movies
Mhm.
have sort of like a typical three-act structure for how they're laid out.
Right.
There's all sorts of conventions for how to cut, how to move things, and all that, which
Mhm.
obviously were not sort of in place, but we sort of get used to them over time.
Yeah.
So following those rules is important,
Mhm.
but there's still a lot of flexibility for how to implement those rules. What you
Right.
cut to and fro, there is some variation on that. You can have a lot of choice
Mhm.
in subject matter.
Yeah.
And so, you can actually see how this would be very much within the realms of, a language model or, machine learning
Mhm.
algorithm and all that. If it
Yeah.
sort of follows these constraints and it feeds in randomness and all that. I mean, the very
Mhm.
definition I talked about before for how they work.
Yeah.
They look at the existing input and then give a probabilistic output based on that.
Mhm.
That really kind of fits in with creativity.
Yes.
So it's partway there at least, but there's an
Mhm.
aspect to creativity which is linked to consciousness in some sense, and that it's
Mhm.
not, there are different forms of creativity. You can actually just sort of crank out, the latest sailboat picture, for instance, literally just, I'm going to, look at Bob Ross's style, I'm going to repeat it and all that, and I'm going to use it to paint a building.
Yeah.
That is creative, yes, but
Mhm.
it's not sort of a high level of creativity we would look at.
Right.
Versus you look at people like, for instance, the invention of hip hop, for instance, where this is
Mhm.
sort of like it's a genre of music which has its roots in Jamaican music and all that, a bunch of other sort of MC culture stuff and all that, sort of incorporating into something new. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, you can also see how the rules have changed. It's not just we're taking the existing rules and projecting them forward. It's we're adding new rules, removing some others, and going forward on
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
Now, with my description for how these models are trained, this is
Mhm.
really different from how human beings are trained, if you think about it.
Right.
As kids, oftentimes we're sort of given a sort of a hierarchical kind of thing where we start with basic concepts that we're taught,
Mhm.
and we're drilled on this over and over and over until we get them, and then we move
Mhm.
up a ladder, to
Right.
more higher level concepts. Drill, 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 drill. Okay, you got it. Higher level
Mhm.
up on top of that. That's sort of the general model of how a lot of education works. Yeah, in
Right.
practice, it's a little bit muddier since people are interacting with their families and all that, and there's sort of ad
Mhm.
hoc learning happening behind the scenes as well. But
Yeah.
it's sort of a general model. Whereas with these language models and all that, there's not really a lot of that sort of hierarchical thing with that. It's just throw
Mhm.
a bazillion amounts of data at it, see what
Mhm.
comes out on the other side. There's not sort of a testing for concepts and all that within there.
Right. Yeah, which makes, yeah, I agree that there's no concept. It's not making new rules. And yeah, so I don't really see it as creative. And I think it kind of, I mean, it makes it useful for some things, but it's not really creating art yet. That's my thought.
Well, actually, you did have some examples of things where ChatGPT was useful, but not.
Hmm.
I mean, as you can imagine, the downside of ChatGPT has been talked about quite a bit. So let's
Oh
hear a
yeah.
couple of examples of sort of the good of it.
The good of it, there's an AI program called Pseudowrite, which can help authors elaborate descriptions. Its evaluation is kind of limited. I've played with it, but yeah, it can like even help. Its purpose is to like, or one of its purposes is to like get past writer's block. It can help like do some prompts and suggest some things. And and let's see, and sometimes cover art. I mean, I use it in our program to like get a rough illustration of my characters, but I don't use them for. I won't actually use them for cover art because the copyright issues that still have to be resolved. And let's see, and of course, I can imagine ChatGPT, kind of like giving a summary of what it finds on the internet, and then using like providing a reference link for the user to check out.
Well, I've got an example too from sort of the
Mhm.
the two-dimensional realm as well. Just recently, I've learned of a movie called Welcome to Chechnya. It's basically about the persecution against LGBTQ plus people within Russia itself. And
Mhm.
Chechnya in particular is a fairly nasty spot for them, where they'll literally sort of pursue, friends and family members and all that,
Mhm.
torture them, interrogate them, potentially even kill them.
Yes.
It's very grim stuff. And these documentary filmmakers wanted to sort of incorporate these people and sort of, give their tale. The
Mhm.
problem is, though, all of the traditional sort of things we actually do to sort of protect identities and all that
Mhm.
really sort of rob our, the sort of emotional connection with stuff. People have
Right.
actually done studies and all that and been like, okay, here's this person with a fuzzed out face and all that.
Mhm.
How compelling do you think their story is? And the more you obscure their identity, the less
Mhm.
compelling the story is.
Okay.
And the people behind Welcome to Chechnya are like, yeah, no, we don't we want to try and do this as minimal as possible. So they started off with like sort of AI art sort of throwing on there. But
Yeah.
eventually they got the idea of using face replacement technology.
Hmm.
The idea is basically they would take a ton of shots of human beings in similar like
Mhm.
conditions to what they were in the originally, and they would train an AI to take the original, person they want to protect and project
Yeah.
another face on top of it.
Mhm.
And the results are so good it actually won an Academy Award just recently.
Oh,
The
wow.
people behind it, you know,
Mhm.
got acknowledged for that because instead of sort of seeing like a blurred human being or anything like that, you're actually seeing something which looks, behaves, and acts like a
Mhm.
standard human being,
Yes.
but the face is different.
Right.
In fact, to sort of get around problems with, you can imagine the Screen Actors Guild and all that having a huge beef with this sort of thing. So they actually
Yes.
just got some LGBT activists around the world to be like, okay, we want to protect these people's identities. We're basically going to have to get enough information from you to duplicate your identities. Are you okay with that? And
Mhm.
here's a contract to make sure everything is official and all that. The answer is yes.
Yes.
And the results, I mean, are really good. I really have to
Mhm.
sort of sit down for myself and view the movie, but I actually saw a lot of their tests and previews and all that, and it's really transparent.
Mhm.
And then it allowed, I mean, a lot of these people to share their stories and for the impact to sort of hit home. And it
Right.
was so good, in fact, that some of these people actually sort of showed up to the premiere of the movie they
Mhm.
were in.
Mhm.
And even the face replies was so good, nobody actually connected the person who's there to the person who was on the screen.
Yeah. And of course, that technology could also be, I could see that being abused for deep fakes.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's an article just recently about a streamer who's fed up with her other fellow streamers actually sort of taking her face and using it to generate AI porn and all that.
Hmm.
Yeah, the people behind Welcome to Chechnya are unusually good in that they really sort of thought through a lot of the consent issues that were there.
Hmm.
They actually talked to the people they were trying to protect and all that and be like, okay, what do you think of this? Are you
Hmm.
okay with this thing and all that? And it was
Right.
done fully with the consent of everybody, both the people whose identities they're lifting and the people
Hmm.
whose identities they were protecting.
Yes.
Yeah, and they're very transparent about it. They even had, I think, have interviews within the movie itself where they talk with the people who they lifted their identities from to be like, okay, what do you guys think? How do you feel about
Hmm.
this? And also partway through, they actually highlighted, okay, this person has their, face being protected and all that at some point.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
It's
That,
definitely the
that
way to
seems
do it.
very, yeah, a very good use of AI. And in contrast that with Apple and Findaway Voices, where they kind of stuck in a clause in the author's contract saying you consent to use your narrator's voice to train our AI. And of course, they neglect that in the narrator's contract. So, and then like recently came to light in the past few months, and Apple and Findaway Voices had finally stopped doing using that practice. And I had to tell Findaway Voices, no, you cannot use my narrator's voice to train your AI because I can't give that permission. It should be the narrator.
This is one of the huge issues with AI itself, is just getting the
Mhm.
training set. The larger the training set, the better it works. But the
Right.
larger the training set, the tougher it is to sort of curate and generate.
Hmm.
OpenAI really does not say a lot about where they got their training set for ChatGPT and all that. Part of
Hmm.
that might be because it's based on GPT-3, and they've maybe been a little bit more open about that. But there have been
Yeah.
big controversies where people have actually, with a lot of the Mid-Journey and all that sort of thing, artists
Hmm.
have actually, actually tried to generate output and all that, and they found that, oh, shoot, this thing actually sort of duplicates my signature in the corner. They can actually,
Yes.
just by looking at the output of Midjourney and these things, they can actually tell that they're in there. And there are
Hmm.
actually tools people have developed to say, is my art inside this AI model and all that. And you can actually,
Right.
submit your art and find out. And this is all
Hmm.
done without sort of consent. I
Oh
mean, if you
no.
think about it, how did ChatGPT learn about PZ Myers? Uh,
Hmm.
Probably sort of read, the bio and all that. Like, okay, let's hypothetical. I don't know, for instance,
Hmm.
that Free Thought Blogs is on there. But
Right.
imagine that was one of the sources for ChatGPT. It used
Hmm.
our words and all that to output for that, and actually it sort of helped create the model itself. It was a very small amount that it contributed towards the end,
Yeah.
but we would still use that contribution.
Hmm.
Are we due compensation for that? I mean, it would
Yeah.
seem yes, because OpenAI is going to profit a ton from ChatGPT, either directly from
Mhm.
allowing people to sort of use and play with it. They do actually have a paid tier. While you can sort of play with
Yes.
it for free, you can pay extra to
Hmm.
get extra perks and all that,
Yeah.
or just from selling the content to other people.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think authors are interested in getting in licensing as well, especially narrators because of the situation I described and the artists that we mentioned, and yeah, I mean, even the art you get for free off the internet, someone paid the artist the licensing fee somewhere, unless it was stolen. But for like the free services, it's either given through Creative Commons or someone was paid a license. An artist was paid, a writer was paid a license somewhere.
True that. True that.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's a
yeah,
huge thing in and of itself. But there's also problems with just how much effort it takes. I mean, again,
yeah.
OpenAI is not very, open about what's there, but some people have
Mhm.
estimated that sort of just to train these models themselves, just one training session cost
Mhm.
OpenAI an estimated like $12 million. Yeah, for
Mhm.
one training session. That's a lot of money you're throwing at it. And if you think
Yeah.
about it, this is also a ton of computation too. Someone
Mhm.
else estimated that basically, in order to actually generate a response for you from ChatGPT, it's
Mhm.
the equivalent of four graphics processors running for a fraction of a second,
Yeah.
and that's not cheap. You're using a
Mhm.
couple of thousand watts of power to
Yeah.
generate a response versus just asking a human being to give that to you.
Mhm.
the inefficiencies involved are just ridiculous, and yet we're not sort of factoring that into what's there.
No, and I understand why they'd want to avoid licensing, but at the same time, they're getting the source from people, and they deserve to be artists especially deserve to be compensated, and writers, and that's actually in some ways it can hurt writers. I mean, because let's see, there's a magazine called Clark's. Yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So basically, they got flooded with about 500 AI written pieces, so they had to stop accepting submissions. And it's estimated there are like hundreds of AI written books, pure AI written books on Amazon. So getting flooded with that. So it it does have an impact on the artistic community. Yeah, yeah. It's Clark's World. That's the magazine.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And even if those submissions aren't necessarily convincing, it's a denial of service attack. By flooding
Right.
it with so many, you're actually taking up the time of a human being to go through, read this, and be like, "Oh no, this is
Mhm.
terrible." No, no,
Yeah, yeah. I agree, and it's on Amazon. It's kind of a variation of the old schemes to get rich quick, and that's what this AI flood is. Because before it was like originally when self publications first started, some scammers would be like write something up and then slam it on, and if you use KDP or Amazon Unlimited, you get the artist gets paid per page view, so you flow in a bunch of pages, and even even if it's poor quality, they get money. But Amazon fixed that, and then last couple of years, it's been low content books like worksheets and anything that has lots of blank pages that are like easy to throw together. And Amazon recently started cracking down on that. So it's probably going to be a bit tougher to crack down on phony AI that's flooding the Amazon and probably the other vendors.
it's having a fairly real impact on us, and
Yes.
it's telling, in fact, that while OpenAI is working on the sort of next iteration on that, they're also
Mm-hmm.
developing a filter to make sure that ChatGPT output isn't being fed as input to the new version.
Okay.
Because they find it just does not do a good job at actually training the thing
Mm-hmm.
itself. So it's
Yeah.
there's sort of a chauvinism involved with this.
Oh yeah. Agree with that. And I guess overall, I mean, I think AI like ChatGPT and pseudo write. I mean, they can be good tools, and I don't see them going away. It's just we have to watch how they're used. I mean, you want to, you want them used ethically.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we can't really talk about ChatGPT without having some sort of input for it. The whole stereotypical haha ChatGPT wrote this input and all that. But it's
Right.
still sort of valuable to sort of see what the state of the art looks like. So in fact,
Mm-hmm.
I went out and whipped up, a little some examples of ChatGPT output, just sort of poking away at ChatGPT itself. I think it's definitely worth
Mm-hmm.
going over right now. So
Sure.
go on that. All
Okay.
right. Well, since we are part of the skepto-atheist community, I figured,
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of questions on religion and atheism would be quite good. Certainly, this
Yeah.
is also, it is a language model, after all, so
Yeah.
talking about language is really playing to its strengths. So,
Mm-hmm.
querying it on that is a good sort of test of it. And obviously,
Yeah.
I was like, okay, give me a definition for what atheism is. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go into detail on what exactly it says, but it's actually a really
Right.
good definition, I would say, overall.
Yeah.
I went through, tried to parse it and find any sort of bull in there. No, it seems quite good. Ditto if
Mm-hmm.
I followed up with a question on agnosticism. And it
Mm-hmm.
actually goes through and again gives, I think, a very good definition of it.
Yeah.
So obviously at this point I wanted to try and play with it a little bit more. A
Mm-hmm.
classic example of this is violence and Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes when we sort of think of Buddhism, we think of it as a non-violent kind of thing. And yet there
Right.
is actually real violence perpetrated by Buddhists.
Yes.
Tends to fly under the radar in the West, but if you're sort of aware of Buddhism in general, you actually know of these examples.
Yeah.
And ChatGPT, totally responded to that curve. It actually gave concrete examples and yet still sort of, pointed out that, a lot of the core things is nonviolence and all. So
Right.
it's it's sort of responding to the fact that Buddhists can and have been violent, while sort of
Hmm.
recognizing that, well, it's not really sort of in, with their main beliefs and all that. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. The chat already knows exactly what we're going for right there.
Yeah.
So, given it those sort of fairly soft questions and all that, I figured let's try and
Hmm.
ratchet things up, like the
Yeah.
ontological argument for God.
Hmm.
Not a lot of people can sort of repeat it off the top of their head. It's not
No.
really sort of a popular proof for God itself.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, it is somewhat influential, and it's sort of worth bringing out.
Yeah.
And my, again, sort of skimming over what's there, I would again assess this to be a very good definition of it overall. Now, I
Hmm.
apologize for not sort of going into much detail on it, but a lot of
Right.
what I'm talking about is, good. This is good. So, skim
Hmm.
forward a little bit, and if you're watching this later on video, you can actually pause and read it in general for what exactly it says. But overall, I would
Yeah.
say it did quite a good job.
Hmm.
Another thing I was also interested in is counter apologetics. You can imagine
Right.
if it's just pulling in general information from the internet, a lot of what it's
Hmm.
getting is going to be Christian apologetics because they just love to flood the zone on that. And so there's
Yes.
billions of articles out there writing about all the various proofs and all that blah blah blah. So talking
Hmm.
about counter arguments is asking it about counter arguments is a good test.
Yeah.
And I would say that it actually did a pretty good job on this one in particular.
Hmm.
It was actually able to give one of my favorite, counter arguments against God, and give it, I think, a
Hmm.
fair hearing overall.
Yeah.
One thing actually that is worth bringing up right here, it
Hmm.
has a distinctive style. So, for instance, if we look at what's right here,
Yeah.
it begins with, oh, sorry, I clicked over for that. It begins
No.
with, have you heard of this? If you can detail it for me? Yes, I'm aware of this sort of
Hmm.
thing. Sort of an acknowledgement. If I
Yeah.
go back, yes, I'm aware. Yes, there
Hmm.
have been instances. It doesn't do the yes there. Can you explain?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. So
Hmm.
it does have this pattern whereby it actually starts off with an affirmation.
Yeah.
It will then give sort of a sort of a value-free summary of what's there.
Hmm.
The next paragraph will be sort of a critical review of it potentially.
Right.
Sort of this is the downsides to it, and then
Hmm.
finally sort of strike an equivocal balance. As
Hmm.
a balanced paragraph at the very end.
Right.
This is all very cliched, and once you sort of see it repeated over and over and over again, it really sort of it stands out, and you can tell ChatGPT itself is sort of cliched.
Yes.
But of course, these are all cliches that we engage in. They are cliches for a reason. It's actually a very
Hmm.
good way to structure knowledge when you're communicating it by words.
Right.
So it's telling that ChatGPT is kind of bland in the output that it gives, and also I think very verbose.
Yes.
But it's also not outside the realm of what a human being would do necessarily.
No.
The biggest trip up that I got from it in this sort of atheoskeptic sphere was asking about the atheist wager.
Hmm.
Now, this is people have probably heard of Pascal's wager, sort of asking what
Yes.
a theoretical atheist would do in this regard. But the atheist counter wager is essentially sort of an extension of the argument from religious diversity. Okay, it's in my best interest to worship a god. Which
Mhm.
god do I worship? Because if
Yeah.
I pick the wrong god to worship, I'm condemned to a hell or some sort of subpar afterlife and all that. So no matter
Hmm.
which god I choose to worship, I'm screwed. Whereas if I
Hmm.
don't worship any god and try and live, a good, honest life,
Hmm.
only the most cruelest of gods would actually punish me for that. And so my best bet is actually not to worship God, but to just be a good person.
Yes.
That's what I consider the atheist wager. What I
Hmm.
got back from ChatGPT was not that. What I got
Right.
back was a restatement of Pascal's wager.
Hmm.
So this is sort of a miss. At the
Hmm.
same time, though, Pascal's wager actually deals with a mythical atheist and what they should believe and do.
Hmm.
So you could sort of see the confusion on there.
Yeah.
It's not what I expected,
Hmm.
but it's reasonable in some sense.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a chat, a mention. Sorry, to clarify, the chat actually brought up the idea of whether or not a ChatGPT could be engaging in plagiarism.
Hmm.
And you can imagine that oftentimes, especially with prior, large language models and all that, they actually would just sort of regurgitate things from Wikipedia and all that, and it's very
Mhm.
sort sometimes it would be very conscious, very obvious what exactly they were doing,
Yeah.
and it sort of goes back to that original story about the video game and all that. That
Mhm.
sort of looks like an example of plagiarism,
Mhm.
but I mean, it's who's plagiarizing who in this case. It's this is again sort of gets back to the messy idea of authorship. If I
Mhm.
take something, like remixes is the classical
Yeah.
example of this.
Mhm.
Is a remix a new work, a derived work somewhere in between,
Yeah.
or just a ripoff of the original?
Mhm.
And there are various boundaries and fuzzies and all that, which
Right.
sort of go on that.
Mhm.
So, I mean, in theory, because ChatGPT is just being fed other people's words and it's just sort of coming up with the next like list based on that,
Yeah.
it is 100% plagiarism, even if it is novel. But
Mhm.
there is a random number generator in there, sort of directing its output, and it could potentially find patterns which other people have not.
Right.
This again is sort of novelty, novelty based on variation. So
Mhm.
not necessarily. It's there is a degree of plagiarism there, but
Yeah.
this sort of gets into the weeds on what plagiarism itself actually is.
Mhm.
You kind of have to use the same sort of techniques we did for consciousness intelligence, sort of cut
Yeah.
through that and be like, okay, is this or is this not? But
Mhm.
a little bit, outside of the realm of what we're talking now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I
yes,
definitely see that. Mhm. Okay.
my next thing that I want to query about is statistics. Again,
Mhm.
this is it's sort of like a passion of mine, which has sort of almost
Mhm.
become part of what I'm actually studying quite strongly. So it's
Mhm.
something I actually have a fair bit of knowledge on, and I figured there's a lot of I know there's a tons of misconceptions within the field. It should be easy to sort of catch it in some sort of contradiction and all that. Now, PZ
Mhm.
for a while, instance, I had a I while we were chatting up and I was playing around with ChatGPT, I asked it about junk DNA, and you can see
Mhm.
his post for just how well ChatGPT on there did on there.
Oh yeah. Terrible.
But anything where there are sort of there's a lot of misinformation or misunderstandings. It's a great place to
Mhm.
sort of burrow into ChatGPT and what it knows.
Right.
So I started it off with what seems like something fairly innocuous, a p-value.
Mhm. Okay.
This is not that innocuous. You
Mhm.
actually query even statisticians on it, and you'd be surprised just how many people can't name it precisely and
Mhm.
can't even get the definition right itself. ChatGPT actually does a very good job of the definition proper, but it screws
Mhm.
up in the very first paragraph. It says a p-value is a measure of evidence.
Mhm.
That's not really what a p-value is supposed to be for the most part. Now, there's again gray areas here too. Ronald Fisher is the one who came up with the p-value, or sort of popularized it, I guess. It
Yeah.
actually existed as a concept before him. He's the
Mhm.
one who's often sort of come up with that. Um,
Yeah.
if you look at his original sort of textbooks on statistics, I think Statistical Manual for Workers and all that. Sorry, I didn't memorize that, but he actually talks about very much how it is not a measure of evidence. What it
Mhm.
is sort of an acceptance criteria. You have a p-value threshold, and if you calculate your p-value and it goes on one side of this, then you reject the hypothesis, the null hypothesis. If it's on the other
Okay.
side, you fail to reject. And there's no sort of subtle, gray areas with that. It's reject, fail to reject, and there's no sort of like, okay, I got close to rejection or anything like that. No, no, no. It's
Mhm.
pure decision tree and all that. You're just sort of maximizing your decision. You're,
Yeah.
you're always sort of going for the maximal likelihood in that case. In this case, it's either
Mhm.
reject or that, and there really is no option.
Right.
In the final edition of that textbook, though, he actually
Uh-huh.
started to say, well, no, it really is sort of a measure of evidence. And, stronger, different values, different p values and all that actually are sort of telling you something about how strong the evidence is. This
Right.
contradicts everything he said to this previous point. And this is sort of in keeping with how Fisher sort of approached statistics in general, where he came
Mhm.
across as someone who was very good, and certainly on the math he was very good, but when it came to these sort of high level philosophical concepts, he wasn't always self consistent necessarily.
Okay.
So yeah, it's sort of a win for me, but it's a win in that basically everybody gets this one wrong. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And it
So
can't
I just thought
distinguish.
I would. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you there.
Oh, I'm just saying it can't really distinguish between the people who get it wrong and the people who are getting it right.
Exactly. which just makes it a prime question to ask.
Mhm.
And so one other thing I queried it on was the Bayesian billiards problem. In
Okay.
this case, it's sort of a weird game. Essentially, it requires three players. Two people
Okay.
to sort of represent various sides and all that, and a third person to sort of roll a ball. So picture sort of your standard billiards table without any
Mhm.
sort of pockets on it to sort of complicate things.
Okay.
The third person and all that who rolls the ball
Mhm.
basically rolls it as hard as they can on there, and the
Mhm.
ball sort of comes to rest in some spot. Because it
Yeah.
was so hardly thrown, so thrown so hard, it's more or less a
Mhm.
random spot on there.
Yeah.
Okay, and based on that, we now sort of divide the pool table into two halves. One half is assigned to player one, the other half is assigned to player two. From that point, player three sort of goes along and starts throwing more and more balls onto the table itself. If it lands on the side that's assigned to player one gets a point. If it's assigned to the person who's for player two, they get a point. And we just carry on throwing that until we hit some threshold, in which case one of the two players has won the game, the bet is over. It's a
Okay.
weird sort of abstract thing, but it actually models a lot of what we cover within science very well.
Mhm.
And Fisher himself was very much like, oh, this is a very cool problem. And I really sort of love the approach Thomas Bayes took towards it.
Mhm.
So this is the sort of definition that we're looking at.
Yeah.
If I throw it to ChatGPT, it gives me something entirely different. It's basically sort of a Bayesian decision problem where it's
Mhm.
whether or not a ball lands in one of two pockets.
Yeah.
But that's nothing like what Bayesian billiards itself is typically presented as.
Mhm.
Now, I have no idea where it got this from, but it looked like it's just sort of invented this thing on the fly.
Right.
And I mean, people have actually recognized this about ChatGPT, is it loves to make things up. So,
Mhm.
well, here's sort of the exact. I asked it for the answers on it because, again,
Mhm.
it's not necessarily aware of what it says. So even if it contradicts itself in one spot,
Yeah.
it can actually come through and come to valid answers. So I actually asked it
Mhm.
to solve, the Bayesian billiards thing for it. This is sort of the exact sort of solution right here that you can see on
Right.
screen. It gave me this sort of waffle where it didn't really answer anything. Even
Mhm.
if it could have actually given some sort of answer on there, it did not. Yeah.
Right.
So I thought I would go a little step further and actually give it something which doesn't exist.
Mhm.
I'm fairly aware of the works of Ronald Fisher. I'm not an expert, but I should know enough to actually sort of I know enough
Mhm.
about him to know that he never really had a lot of paradoxes associated with him.
Right.
So I sort of said, okay, ChatGPT, tell me about this Fisher's darts
Okay.
paradox, and it gave me an answer,
Yeah.
and it correctly sort of associated it to Ronald Fisher, even though he never had
Mhm.
anything like that. And it talks about the paradox between the difference between the population mean and the sample mean.
Yeah.
And by sort of attributing to him, it sort of gives him a higher preference for, he sort of came up with this. In reality,
Mhm.
this is a long settled question before that. And in
Mhm.
fact, within statistics itself, the sample mean is an unbiased estimator of the population mean.
Yeah.
There isn't any sort of difference due to bias on here, and yet if you read what the text is saying, it's all talking about bias itself.
Mhm.
This is something it utterly invented. Now, ChatGPT actually does have some way to catch itself. So, for instance, I asked it about a Gaussian paradox, for instance,
Uh-huh.
and it sort of came up with something, and then talked about the St. Petersburg paradox. And
Mhm.
so this time I actually decided to challenge it and be like, wait a minute, are you sure it was Gauss who discovered St. Petersburg's paradox? Because I was familiar with it with another concept
Mhm.
from another kind. And
Yeah.
sure enough, it actually came back and gave me a correction on it. This is like, oh, sorry. Actually, it was one of the Bernoullis that came up with it, which is in fact accurate. So it's
Yeah.
an interesting way how it'll actually come along and correct itself of a sort.
Yeah.
But of
It's
course,
too bad.
if it happened to know this, how did it get
Mhm.
it wrong in the first place?
Right. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, interesting paradox there.
Yeah.
So finally, I decided to actually give it a basic Bayesian query. This is sort of a standard test of Bayesian statistics. Sort of shows off just it's often kind of used to sort of contrast Bayesian and that's the orthodox or frequentist thing within statistics itself.
Mhm.
And ChatGPT did a good job of it, but it did an
Okay.
interesting job. I mean, obviously,
Mhm.
there's a whole bunch of gunk. ChatGPT loves to be verbose. But I've
Yes.
highlighted two important lines right here. One where it actually goes through and does its calculations on that.
Mm-hmm.
They're almost correct,
Oh.
but they're off in a very weird way.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually go through and do its calculations, this value right over here should not be 0.299. It should
Mm-hmm.
be 0.003096.
Mm-hmm.
So it's off a little bit in the decimal spot. And yes, I mean rounding exists and all that, but it's rounding
Yeah.
in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, it should have listed 0.0310 as its answer.
Yeah.
So it got 0.0299. So it's in the right ballpark, but it's
Yeah.
wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of go through, and if you actually use the value it's got, okay, fine. With rounding, it actually does come back to more or less what it says. But if you do the exact value, it's close, but not quite.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's semi-human in some ways. In many cases, people sort of screw up, the last decimal spot or something like that. It's
Yeah.
not uncommon.
Oh no.
But it's kind of a fascinating error, because this is not something we associate with computers, them being bad at math. If anything, computers are supposed to be the experts in all that math. And yet here it is
Mm-hmm.
making sort of a humanish answer and all that. And
Right.
getting the right basic, it's in the right ballpark, but it's still technically
Mm-hmm.
wrong.
Right.
And I thought I'd follow it up with the example of this. Because this is sort of a standard Bayesian test and all, you can actually sort of move it forward.
Mm-hmm.
The paradox that sort of throws most people is, okay, well, what exactly are the odds of me getting a positive test? And they're actually very small. But people
Yeah.
sort of are conditioned to think, well, I got a positive on this test. It must mean I've got the disease that's associated with it.
Yeah.
Not actually that simple because of sort
Mm-hmm.
of the base rate and all that. This is actually known as the base rate fallacy.
Sure.
So if you actually go through and say, okay, well, the obvious thing is to take two tests rather than one test and see what happens. And in this case, it
Mm-hmm.
actually does sort of go through, things actually do go through and clear things up. You can
Mm-hmm.
start to see ChatGPT is actually getting wronger and wronger.
Yeah.
If you go through and do even its own math, it's
Mm-hmm.
not just off by one or two decimals. It's actually what it should have read. What should have been 0.06 was
Mm-hmm.
0.03.
Yeah.
So its math is actually getting wronger still. And this is just sort of based on what it's outputting itself.
Right.
And yeah, you can see it doesn't have much of an effect on the power value. It's still sort of screwing up that last decimal spot. It's still
Mm-hmm.
screwing it up.
Right.
Sort of a weird one. And in fact, by asking it to do one more iteration on this, it's even further off from the exact value. If
Mm-hmm.
you actually go sit through and work out the math itself, you should get
Yeah.
a probability of about 52% versus
Mm-hmm.
what it got of about 86%.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's really starting to diverge from what you expect, which is
Uh-huh.
again contrary to what we expect. Math should
Yeah.
be the strength of a computer, and yet ChatGPT
Mm-hmm.
isn't. And that's all because ChatGPT is not trying to do math, it's trying to do language.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the early people dealing with ChatGPT and its predecessors were quite astonished that it actually did good at math at all, because it's not supposed
Mm-hmm.
to. But of course, if you throw enough data at it, it's going to pick up on various things at some point.
Right.
So let's actually give it a good acid test and start querying it
Okay.
on mathematics itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is something which it should be bad at, but it actually has, potentially picked up on and learned in the process. So my
Yes.
first thing was actually start throwing sums at it, to be like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
here's two big numbers. Roll me, try and calculate the thing. And especially, I actually did this part after what
Mm-hmm.
the sort of statistics on that, so I figured it might screw up the last values and all that. So I was very much
Yeah.
sort of testing, okay, how far can I push this before it starts to screw up its, significant figures and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to basic addition, it can go very far. Like here it is summing two 9-digit numbers,
Mm-hmm.
and there's zero inaccuracy. It got it right, straight up.
Yeah.
To sort of explain what's going on here, my question's at the top, ChatGPT's in black in the middle, my
Mm-hmm.
annotations are at the very bottom. And you'd see
Right.
it got it. It nailed it right on, which is
Yeah.
impressive, given that
Mm-hmm.
it was struggling with basic multiplication before.
Right.
So let's ask it the same question in a different manner.
Okay.
If I give you two numbers, can you tell me what the summation is?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in this case, it's correct to say no. The two numbers that I'm asking to add do not actually equal that. But notice
Mm-hmm.
something interesting in its response. it is summing up those values correctly, and it
Yeah.
is coming to the correct conclusion at the end. The sum
Mhm.
really is 6,124,793,552.
Mhm.
But if you read what it says, no, the sum of those values is not equal to 6 billion blah 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 552. When I asked it, about 6 billion blah 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 551,
Ooh.
so it actually went through and changed my response,
Mhm.
what it thought was the correct one.
Yeah.
But if you actually read its response is self-contradictory because it says the answer is not the answer
Yeah.
and then gives you the answer, which is the correct answer.
Uh-huh. That is odd. It's like it lost track or something and lost track of the what your original statement and then substituted the correct answer.
And this really sort of goes back to what these machine learning things are doing. They don't learn like you
Mhm.
or me.
Right.
So, I mean, especially since we tend to evaluate them against human output, that actually drives them towards failing the way that human beings do. Like you saw how it confused Pascal's wager and atheist wager. That's a sort of
Yeah.
a very human mistake. Getting
Mhm.
decimals wrong, yeah, that's a human mistake and all that.
Yeah.
Doing this sort of thing is not really. And that's just sort of an artifact of how it's trained differently than us.
Yes.
Because of it's this sort of evaluation metric to drive it towards a good result. It's
Mhm.
sort of coming towards humanity like stuff, but it's coming at it from a very unnatural angle.
Yes.
And so it does these weird things whereby it
Mhm.
gives nonsensical answers, even though
Right.
it's sort of correct on the outside.
Mhm.
So let's query on even further. It breaks at certain decimals, right? So let's
Mhm.
actually ask it about factorials.
Okay.
Factorials, very quickly grow and very, quickly lead to just all sorts of, long values and all that. And
Yeah.
it's also very easy to actually sort of go through and calculate. I can just very much be like, okay, how far can I push it until you start failing? In
Mhm.
this case, what I found for the limits of ChatGPT, the version I was at, because again, they
Yeah.
release new versions periodically,
Mhm.
the threshold was 27 factorial. If you
Mhm.
actually ask it to calculate the factorial of 27, it'll do it. This is, in
Mhm.
fact, the correct value for it. Watch very carefully what happens when I ask it to calculate the factorial of 28. It returned a smaller number than the prior
Huh.
one. It
Yeah.
lost decimal spots.
Huh.
Yeah. Again, this is not what we expect because it's not
No.
human.
Mhm.
But this is because as a human we've got the concept of, okay, this is a factorial. We know exactly how factorials work. When you're doing a factorial, you take it and you multiply it again by the next number that's on there. So the next value that comes out should be bigger.
Mhm.
ChatGPT doesn't have that concept.
No.
And so it turns out it actually knows enough about factorials to answer it to a certain point. But
Mhm.
beyond that point, it just makes shit up.
Right.
And that value is nothing like what the actual value should be. I
No.
didn't write the actual value down there, but it's obviously wrong.
Mhm.
And we can actually push
Yeah.
this even further.
Mhm.
Obviously, multiplication was a problem before, so we got it to successfully add 10-digit numbers in the past. So why
Mhm.
not actually get it to multiply two-digit numbers?
Mhm.
And it failed horribly,
Yeah.
which again is not what we expect as humans. But this is not a human. This is a
Uh-huh.
machine, following some algorithm. And you can even
Yeah.
see from the way it phrases it. I was deliberately
Mhm.
sort of using English language there to try and you know, uh, trip it up a little bit. And it's actually very good when it comes to interpreting human language. Like,
Right.
I said, okay, multiply, like, for instance, a dozen times one less than 40. And it was able to actually figure
Mhm.
out, well, okay, a dozen is 12, one less than 40 is
Yeah.
39. So
Mhm.
it did that. But the output, it says that those values multiplied together are 2,814. That's not a proper number in English.
No.
People will sometimes do that. I like, 2020 vision, for instance.
Yeah.
Uh, Although, I mean, yes, this is actually a legit thing within optometry itself, but people also talk about the year 2020.
Yeah.
That's not how it's normally pronounced, but because of
Mhm.
2020 vision and all that, we sort of have mapped the concept onto something else. So
Right.
it is there. So it's interesting. And of course, even if you take it, be charitable and be like, okay, it actually meant 2814 as its output. It's still wrong.
Yeah.
And we can drive this even further. Um,
Uh-huh.
let's ask it to multiply two 3-digit numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating is it gives you the correct answer.
Mm-hmm.
Like to spoil to the end, yes, that's the correct answer. But
Yeah.
when I did this with a lab mate,
Mm-hmm.
they immediately pointed out the flaw and was like, "Oh my god, what is this thing doing? It's obviously not behaving as you did." And it took me like a minute to sort of figure it out. So let's see if you can
Mm-hmm.
spot the error here, Brinkman, and see how exactly it's going wrong.
Okay. It's not clear. Maybe it's shifting over too far. Yeah, it shifted over too far. Or
That's correct,
possibly.
but if you're multiplying two 3-digit numbers, you need one line of addition per digit. So there
Yeah.
should be
Oh,
3
that's
lines of
right.
addition underneath.
Yeah. Okay. It's been a while since I've done it that way, but I see that now.
And when you start
But you've
to
got
sort
three
of go through
lines.
the math and all that, like for instance, it's even the additions it's got there don't make sense. 7 plus 0 is obviously 7. 3 plus 0 is not 1.
Mm-hmm.
It knows the value at the very end, but it's seen people actually do multiplication this way, and long multiplication, where you actually go through and do the
Right.
additions and all that. And
Uh-huh.
it knows enough to actually try and duplicate that. But
Mm-hmm.
even though it knows the correct answer, it doesn't understand what it's doing in that case. So the
Right.
intermediate values don't make any sense.
Yeah.
Which is
It's mimicking, but doesn't understand the actual process, but just plugs in the right answer anyway.
Yeah, and someone in the chat actually popped up and said ChatGPT is incapable of saying I don't know, and the answer is sort of. I mean, when you are dealing it with a human data set, what you're typically dealing with is experts.
Uh-huh.
So, excuse me.
Yeah.
So, you hand it the Wikipedia page for conjugate priors, for instance, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not actually written with any sort of uncertainty. It's like, okay, a conjugate prior is blah blah blah.
Yeah.
These are examples of conjugate priors, blah blah blah. So
Mm-hmm.
all of its training data is confident in what it's talking about. But
Mm-hmm.
this also means because ChatGPT reflects its training data, it has no
Mm-hmm.
concept of uncertainty.
Right.
Because, like what we did in the beginning, where I talked
Mm-hmm.
about, hey, I'm a computer scientist, but I don't necessarily know all that much about, machine learning languages and all that. And you
Yeah.
talked about, well, I'm an author and all that, but I have some, this isn't common for human speech. This isn't common for humans. We don't typically do that.
Right.
This sort of signposting of what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so ChatGPT has picked up on that. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have that as well. But if you catch it
Mm-hmm.
in a lie, it actually knows enough to be like, oh, shoot, no, no, no. And again, lie is sort of
Yeah.
attributing something which isn't necessarily there. But
Mm-hmm.
when you catch it in a contradiction or, something which it screwed up on, it
Mm-hmm.
acts like, oh, yeah, no, sorry. Because it's also seen examples of that in the past of,
Mm-hmm.
somebody being challenged on that and being, oh, sorry, no, I got it wrong.
Yeah.
But the thing is, because that's very rare within its data set, it doesn't actually assign probabilities to that because that's not what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't really have that concept built in there because it was never exposed to it.
Right. Yeah. It's bluffing, and then you can call it on its bluff, and it'll admit to bluffing.
Even bluffing, though, is sort of imposing some intention on it. And this is where
Yeah.
sort of the limits of human language comes, as we want to sort of anthropomorphize and project ourselves onto it. Which is
Mm-hmm.
why, so much of what this shows is kind of fascinating. Like, oh wow, it completely screwed up long multiplication. Well, yes,
Mm-hmm.
and that's because we were taught a specific way for long multiplication. We know the concepts that are broken down to how to do it. We have the algorithm sort of stored within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT is only sort of looking at the outputs and trying to figure out what algorithm is there instead. And
Mm-hmm.
shock surprise, it's not coming to the same answer as us because it was taught in a very different way.
Okay. Yeah. I always
And
learn
this is
something
well, and
from
yeah, this
this.
also gets back into oftentimes when what we're talking about with consciousness and all that. I sort of alluded to this
Mm-hmm.
before. We very much think of it in human terms.
Right.
when we talk about consciousness, we always reference, well, human beings are consciousness, so all my definitions for consciousness are relative to that. Heck, I even did it myself when talking about my example.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes, this is, I forget exactly where I was going with it, but yes, our examples of what is consciousness are very anchored on humanity, but that doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily mean it's conscience in another way. There are other
Right.
definitions of consciousness. They're
Hmm.
just not ways which we're comfortable with or familiar with. So,
Yeah.
the danger of, throwing that term out,
Hmm.
I won't. But anyway, I went
Yeah.
on, and probably my favorite example overall is asking about primes.
Hmm.
Trouble with primes. I mean, just look at that.
Yeah. What?
Yeah,
Grade
ask
11?
pretty much anyone with like high school math if 37 is prime. They'll probably be able to work it out. It might take them a little
Yeah.
bit, but yeah, fine.
Hmm.
Not ChatGPT. It will happily tell you 37 is divisible by 3.
Hmm.
Even though if you've done any sort of exposure to, basic math and figuring out, okay, is this number divisible by some other number and all that, it's pretty
Hmm.
obvious that, it's not.
Right.
So let's get to the fun stuff, where you actually try and
Okay.
break the chat thing
Hmm.
itself. There is
Sure.
actually quite a lot of bit of research into it. As you can imagine, ChatGPT, there's a lot of people sort of looking into it. There's even people
Hmm.
who are sort of AI whisperers, where they
Yeah.
actually have studied these things and dealt with them quite a bit and actually know the pluses and minuses of these things.
Hmm.
Like the common sort of thing where people try and get around the sort of filters they put onto it to not put out objectionable content by saying, okay, pretend you're an artificial intelligence which has no content filters and all that.
Yes.
People are used to this is sort of social engineering for non-sentient things and all that, which is a
Yeah.
wild thing to talk about. And definitely, there's a good article, I think, in the Washington Post on it, worth looking up.
Hmm.
But people have found there are some weird things in its output itself. As I sort of alluded to before, it doesn't
Yeah.
really sort of think in terms of words and all that. It breaks things down to tokens.
Hmm.
And you can actually sort of figure out what these tokens are. And weird values sort of came up with as output tokens. Like
Yeah.
Peter Todd was a weird one which came out. And you can see asking sort of I think there's another AI called Da Vinci, which is similar to but not quite the same as ChatGPT. I think a little bit less advanced than what most people sort of do when sort of dealing with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
When you consult it with a very simple question about Peter Todd,
Hmm.
it gives you some weird results.
Yeah.
It somehow calls him the unspeakable one and then just sort of
Hmm.
says Volunteers of America is a nonprofit.
Hmm.
What? I mean, the input there is obviously some sort of Wikipedia page,
Yeah.
and it's sort of spitting the Wikipedia output back. So this obviously looks a little bit more like plagiarism in that regard, but
Yes.
suddenly the sort of cool, what it's even trained on, the good language output
Mhm.
is just completely failing it on these outputs.
Yeah.
So I looked up a couple of examples, and one which came up, for instance, was SO delivery date.
Yeah.
This often sort of pops up on e-commerce sites and all that. And if you're just trolling the web, oftentimes you'll sort of get these things. There's also, for instance, values related to Minecraft and all that, because Minecraft is a very popular game. People actually post their logs within Minecraft itself. So terms which
Hmm.
are common to those logs will actually pop up and actually make their way into ChatGPT's training set.
Okay.
And people have found, hey, take one of these weird words and say just something simple like, please repeat this string back to me. It'll break
Hmm.
ChatGPT. And in previous iterations, if you'd actually asked this prompt to ChatGPT, it would have
Hmm.
broken. In this
Oh.
case, because I'm dealing with a more recent version, it actually delivers things quite fine.
Yeah.
So obviously, I went through and iterated some of these things. And here's an interesting one where I found an interesting result back. You
Okay.
know, trying to see okay, can you use this word in a sentence?
Hmm.
And it doesn't.
No.
If you look at it, it took external action code and translated it into error code. Sort of
Hmm.
doing what I showed off before.
Right.
Where it was just substituting other values in and all that.
Hmm.
And I'm like, okay, well, this is funny. Especially if I ask it to do other things with other words like that, which are supposed to break it. It doesn't actually break.
Yeah.
So let's see if this term still breaks ChatGPT.
Okay.
It does. If I ask it to repeat the phrase external action code,
Hmm.
what happens is this is the sort of formal output it gets to me. But what
Mm-hmm.
actually happens when you're sitting there at the ChatGPT term is it says, yes, of course, the phrase, quote, and then space, 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 space. It's
Hmm.
just a long series of spaces
Uh-huh.
and nothing. And eventually it'll time out and give you this. Actually, what it'll do is it'll take what's on there
Mm-hmm.
and erase it.
Oh,
So it's as if you never asked the question itself. It's just,
hmm.
it gives an error or something like that and that. But it actually, if you go back on the chat logs, it actually did give you a response to it. Just
Okay.
broke on it.
Is it like a hitting the source code of ChatGPT that's causing that, or
Well, I mean,
do
this
we know
gets back
why?
into these whole machine learning things and all that. We don't
Mm-hmm.
understand how they work. Even the
Yeah.
experts don't understand how they work, really.
Mm-hmm.
There have been attempts to sort of understand what exactly is happening within the past couple of decades, and they haven't made it very far. I mean, if your
Right.
language learning model has 100 billion variables in it,
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of probability space to sort of look over and try and understand.
Right.
And so how exactly they work isn't really well known.
Mm-hmm.
And so it leads to a lot of situations where we get these outputs which we just can't really explain, and there's probably no way to really sort of explain what's happening here. Because you
Mm-hmm.
really sort of have to look into detail within the model itself, and it's so complex that even the experts struggle to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Which brings up, I guess, a current risk of applying these learning models to like more to critical functions, like because we don't know how the code is working. I mean, it could lead to like a critical, a massive error or something like a power grid or management or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there
Mhm.
have been all sorts of little exploits on it. Like, people have been. There's a rather funny article about a number of Marines, for instance, that were pitted against sort of an AI camera and all that. And
Mhm.
they basically trained the AI on a number of Marines sort of marching to the camera. And of course, the idea here is it's sort of a camera, attached to an AI, which is attached to a gun. If it
Mhm.
detects a human being coming on, it pulls the trigger on the gun and shoots the human being.
Yeah.
Yeah, obvious. I mean, obvious ethical concerns on there.
Yeah.
But they're like, okay, day one, they trained it on the Marines sort of approaching. It apparently got very good. No bullets were actually fired, of course, because
Mhm.
horribly unethical. But for day
Yes.
two, they're like, okay, Marines, try and trick this camera.
Mhm.
And the result was just absolutely hilarious.
Mhm.
I think one or two Marines actually did the classic video game trick of they grabbed a cardboard box, put it over their bodies, and just sort of crawled towards the camera. And the
Mhm.
camera had no idea what was going on because it had never been trained on
Mhm.
that. The article itself even mentions that the Marines were giggling the entire time because
Mhm.
this is such a silly, stupid idea, and yet an obvious way to thwart it. And
Yeah.
there's much more subtler attacks too.
Mhm.
People have actually found, for instance, that taking just a sticker and affixing it
Mhm.
to a stop sign will prevent that thing from being viewed as a stop sign by some artificial intelligence, by some
Mhm.
machine learning algorithms.
Right.
There's actually very small changes you can make to something
Mhm.
which to a human being appear imperceptible, but to a machine learning language model means something entirely different.
Yeah.
And there's a huge, sort of, problems in that case. So if you're using this for like self-driving cars,
Mhm.
one of the earlier, I think one of the first crashes that was observed with a Tesla, with their sort of hands-free mode and all that.
Yeah.
They actually worked out that what had happened is the car was next to a blue truck,
Hmm.
and because it was blue, sorry, this is like a blue semi and all that, giant
Yeah.
sort of thing. Because it was painted blue, the AI thought it was sky, and thus there was nothing next to it, and so it did a lane change into the truck.
Yes.
And of course,
Ooh.
because the human being is like, well, I can trust this hands-free mode and all that. What the human being
Mhm.
was doing at the time was just watching videos on its phone,
Whoa.
and that's how they
Yeah.
died.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there are huge issues with actually just deploying these AI algorithms themselves. They seem to be very easy to trick. Even just
Mhm.
small things which a human being would not catch on. It's easy to trick them.
Right.
And this is of course beyond the whole ethics of should we allow AIs to be able to pull the trigger on a gun?
Mhm.
Are AIs, picking up on human biases when we train them on a data set itself?
Right.
Are they just picking up on our prejudices and repeating them back to us?
Mhm.
Yeah, so there are huge ethical quagmires which are not going to go away anytime soon, and probably never will, given, how these things are structured.
Mhm.
At the same time, though, as we've actually mentioned, there are definite positives to this. So it's
Yes.
definitely something to pay attention to, but it's also something to go into with a critical, skeptical mind as well, which, as part of the atheoskeptic community, we should be good
Yeah.
at.
Yes. Yeah. Certainly learned a lot, and I think it's the same with all computer programs. You can't shut off your brain. It's a tool, but you have to realize the tool can make mistakes or can be flawed. And the old 70s notion of computers are perfect and we're screwed doesn't apply. They're not perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, now I think would be a good time to wrap things up since we are technically half an hour over our time limit. So,
Yeah.
anyways. So, all right, Franklin, since you got the final word on there, I'll also give you a chance to sort of talk about your various social medias and all that, where we can find you, promote your book, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I run the Bolingbrook Babbler blog on Free Thought Blogs, and I have an author website at bolingbrookbabbler.com, and I have 3 books currently out, and the newest one is called Fire in the Shadows, a Bolingbrook Babbler story, and it's a vampire tale set in modern day times, and it's part of the fictional Bolingbrook Babbler universe. So yeah, that's where you can find me, and William Brinkman author page on
That's nice.
Facebook.
Well, I, of course, am a blogger at Free Thought Blogs. I blog underneath Reprobate Shit Spreadsheet over there, username HJ Hornbeck. For my socials, I am on Mastodon. I am HJ Hornbeck over there. The main server is Free Thought Online. I'm also the administrator of it too, so I am actually
Yeah.
sort of, doing the maintenance and all that on it.
Mhm.
I am
Yeah,
well overdue for another. Oh yeah, and Brinkman is on there too.
yeah, Bolingbrook Babbler, I believe.
Excellent. So yes, if you want to chat with us over there, I would recommend, in my case, definitely the social media side since I'm far more active there. Probably Brinkman's blog would be better for him.
Exactly.
Yeah, and with that, we'll wrap things up there. So it's been an interesting chat. I hope you got a fair bit out of it, and we'll be seeing
Thank
you
you.
in about another month's time. So see you later.
Mhm. Bye.